Mishal Husain has sat down with well-known global figures, from Meghan Markle and Prince Harry to Mark Carney and Elon Musk. She is known as one of Britain's best interviewers, with a talent for blending curiosity and tenacity into every conversation. Today, she's the editor-at-large for Bloomberg Weekend and the host of a new video podcast series called The Mishal Husain Show. She commands the attention of powerhouse figures, and she is a powerhouse herself. We are thrilled to have her at CSIS today. I'm Emily Harding, Vice President of the Defense and Security Department here at CSIS, and I'm your guest host. This is Smart Women, Smart Power. So first off, this must be strange for you, for the roles to be reversed. I get to interview you instead of you interviewing someone. Are you ready for this? You good?
I am, but I have to say, it always gives me that sort of little frisson of apprehension, which I think is a good thing for someone who's usually on the other side of the table and the other side of the camera or the microphone, because it does make you think about how it is to be the one answering the questions. And overall, I think answering the questions is harder than asking them.
Absolutely. This is why I'm in the privileged position today. Well, anytime you want to stop and ponder, you stop and ponder. I think we have a great lineup of questions to get into today. But first, congratulations on the success of your new show with Bloomberg, named after you, The Mishal Husain Show. Yeah.
Thank you. Yes, it's been an extraordinary feeling to have a new project at this time in my life and to be much more in the international affairs zone, because that's where I began my career. I spent a long time at the BBC on the international side, and then for the last 10 years plus, I've been working on one of the BBC's premier radio programs domestically. And so I was really immersed in the UK political scene. So now I'm kind of back out where I began and in a different organization and at an extraordinary time in international affairs. So
absolutely.
It's quite a moment.
You're going to bring a wonderful, fresh perspective. I was struck by your recent Instagram post. You said that you have 4 different episodes on your mind at once. Finishing touches on one you've just done, a bonus holiday one, 2 kickoff 2026 episodes. That is quite a lot. You regularly sit down with world leaders, business titans, cultural icons. Tell me about these characters. These are some big personalities that you get to sit down and swap stories with.
Yes, and each one is different and requires not just different preparation, but a different mindset in how am I going to really try and bring this person out. You know, let's take politicians. Earlier I was talking to Keir Starmer a few months ago. As it happens on a really extraordinary moment, the Israelis had started strikes on Iran that very day, and I was going into Downing Street with that kind of atmosphere, hoping the Prime Minister would still fit us in, and he did. But then with the Mishal Husain Show, we launched with Mark Carney, and I'm always conscious of most people will have something prepared that they want to tell you, and your job is to get under their skin and to bring out something different. And the beauty of the way that I work now is that you have time. You sit at the kind of time that we're going to spend together is also the kind of time that each episode of my podcast is. So that means that you want to get to the kind of zone that is far beyond what the day job is. You want to get to their hinterland. You want to get to something about their family, even their childhood. And I often think of it as the answer to the question that I've been asked so often over the years when I interviewed someone for much shorter segments. Afterwards, people would say, but what were they like? You know, what were Prince Harry and Meghan Markle like? And I would fill in around the edges, or I would do the colouring in around the interview. And now I feel I get to do the colouring in as part of the conversation.
So what is your strategy to getting to those real conversations as quickly as possible? I mean, humans, generally speaking, don't love confrontation. You've got to kind of ease into it.
Yeah.
I've noticed with your show that you have a very gentle touch that seems to really get people to open up.
You definitely have to pick the ways that you're going to get to things. Like, for example, when I talked to Elon Musk, he was still working with the administration. He was still in charge of Doge at the time. And he'd been doing it for a few months, and there was lots of evidence about those who'd been affected by the cuts at Doge. And I thought, look, I have to make a choice here. Which of these avenues am I going to pick to explore? And I thought, okay, he was brought up in South Africa. I'm going to choose AIDS funding and the cuts to PEPFAR set up under George W. Bush. because he will have seen the impact of HIV/AIDS in the country
Absolutely.
that he grew up in. And so I chose to pursue that avenue for the reason that I thought it would resonate with him in a way that if I bring up environmental protection or air traffic control, it might not necessarily in the same way. And of course, it was also a very human example. So there are some choices to make ahead of time, but you also need to retain the spontaneity, right? How am I going to respond to something unexpected, the person says. So somewhere between the preparation and the spontaneous moment is the sweet spot.
Mm-hmm. Elon Musk has never done anything unexpected at all, so I'm sure that didn't happen there either. Whoa. So as you've had these wide-ranging conversations with all of these world leaders, what has emerged for you as the big themes of the last year?
Well, what a time it is. And, largely that's because of what's been happening in the city that we're talking. The Trump administration's interactions and attitudes to allies as well as adversaries has been really difficult for countries around the world. And I felt that most strongly when I was talking to Mark Carney, who was absolutely explicit when he didn't just say this is this is an interesting time or this is a challenging time. He said, we're in the midst of a rupture in the world order. And he said Canada did well out of the last world order. And he was explicit about how much has been upended. Canada having to think really hard about how it trades east and west rather than south, right? That means infrastructure. That means ports. It means your supply lines. All of these things which are long-term projects, you end up having to think about them as fast as possible. But I have to say, Emily, look, my own background, my family came to the UK from Pakistan. My family was deeply affected a generation back by the end of the British Empire in India, the partition of India, the birth of the independent nation states of India and Pakistan. So I think I've always grown up, I lived in the Middle East as a child, I've always grown up knowing that that world order that suited so many Western countries so well didn't necessarily suit other parts of the world. And it's quite easy to say, for some of America's allies to say, this is a really hard time and we'd like the old order back. But, that was not a place of universal peace and security and where everyone felt heard. And we're never going to have a world order where everyone felt heard. But perhaps this past year has done something valuable in causing a lot of much needed reassessment of relationships and values and what matters and who your friends are. And maybe not friends, who you have common interests with at a given moment in time and how much you can make out of that. Because all nations have interests and are entitled to pursue those interests through lawful and fair means. Which gets us into a question of
and fair being,
yeah,
right.
Which gets us into a question of subjectivity and perception.
Yeah,
but,
absolutely.
Yeah, I mean, it's an extraordinary and fascinating time in international affairs, to be sure.
I think that idea of creative destruction, it just won the Nobel Prize, right? Like there is a moment where you have an opportunity to build something new, which can be really exciting. But while you're living through it, it feels very unstable. And, I myself consider myself a staunch internationalist, and I believe that America can play a leadership role in the world. We also have to listen to our allies and work with our allies. It has been really interesting to have interactions with European colleagues and talk to them about this current moment and how they are thinking about a world where the U.S. is absent, where the U.S. is not actually leading, and what that looks like for them. One of them joked to me that they think that Canada has relocated itself somewhere between France and the U.K. as opposed to in the north of the United States.
Yeah, but Richard Moore, who gave me his first broadcast interview soon after stepping down as the UK spy chief. And I thought there was a really interesting note of realism in part of what he said, which was that it's quite easy to be really worked up about, countries like Russia and China spying on countries like the UK and the United States. But the note of realizing that he gave is, he said, I tell politicians all the time, we are engaged in espionage too. Therefore, we can't be too evangelical about what's allowed and what's not allowed, because we are also engaged in the pursuit of information through lots of means that we can't necessarily talk about but are going on.
Oh, absolutely. Whenever I grew up in the world of intelligence, right? And whenever something would leak out into the press, we would always make the joke of, oh, I'm shocked to see there's gambling going on here, But of course, all countries are gonna spy against each other all the time. I wanted to ask you though, where in the Middle East did you grow up?
I grew up in the UAE. My father was a doctor, and he had left medical school in Lahore in Pakistan. And at that time, the UK was recruiting doctors. The UK's had a desperate need for doctors from overseas for for decades since. It's something that it's trying to change and now have more homegrown doctors. But he came to the UK as 2 years out of medical school, and he thought he'd work in the National Health Service for a few years. And then, in fact, the Gulf states and that region was opening up in the early 70s, so we moved there. And I had an expatriate childhood, but one I think that's really linked to ending up in international journalism, because when you're part of a diaspora community, you do have a real need for news. News is part of what connects you in the age before social media and before cable TV, right? I'm talking about the 70s and early 80s. So, the thirst for information, I saw my parents live with that. I remember overhearing their conversations. They were talking about the assassination of Indira Gandhi in 1984, or of Anwar Sadat, the Egyptian leader. And so I knew that these things were important. And I think somewhere, I went to university to do law, as you can do law as an undergraduate in the UK. But when I thought, okay, I don't want to be a lawyer, what else can I do with my life? I think there was a natural instinct of I'd grown up with news, and therefore maybe this was an area in which I could make my own professional life. Yeah. And so it proved.
And the UAE has changed dramatically since your childhood. I'm sure you've watched that whole arc.
Yes, but also physically, the reclaiming of land, the actual physical expansion of the country, and of course incredibly glossy architecture. And we used to go on camping trips into the desert, both in the UAE and in Saudi Arabia, where my parents subsequently moved. And of course that's still possible today, but we had a much simpler life than life in that part of the world has now become, for sure.
Yep, for sure. So I also wanted to ask you about AI as one of these big trends that we've seen emerge. Several of your guests on the show have talked about it. It's a lot of the work that we do here at CSIS as well. There's no question that one of the big themes of 2025 was AI, and I suspect 2026 is going to be just a rising trend that way. Time magazine crowned the architects of AI as the 2025 Person of the Year. So what do you think about this emerging AI trend, especially for people in the field of journalism and in creative passions like yours?
Well, two of the guests on my podcast so far are in this field. One of them, Fei Li, the so-called godmother of AI, is in that time group as the only woman in the group. And I also have spoken to Mustafa Suleyman, Microsoft's AI chief. And I think in those conversations, with Fei Li, I was so interested in the development, that question of how we got here, because her work, her organizational work, trying to figure out how do you teach computers? You need to organize the world in some way to help computers learn. And she figured out that she took from linguistics and from psychologists and figured out that you organize objects into categories, and she started training computers in that way, and that led to so much of what we see now, especially because she put her work into the public domain, which she didn't have to do, and that enabled other developments. So I'm fascinated with the journey of how we got here, but also fascinated with how people like Fei Li and Mustafa Suleyman see the world and what they are working on that we are going to be able to use, right? So when Mustafa Suleyman talked to me about autonomous agents, and he believes that an autonomous AI agent will soon be able to make purchases on our behalf, probably checking with us just before it presses the button on our credit card. I'm really interested in all of that because I have a family. I'm the mother of, 3 now pretty much grown up young men, but anything that makes my life easier in that kind of administrative way, I'm here for it. So I'm always doing the kind of, I want the personal takeaways from this, as well as how are we going to regulate this? Do our politicians even understand that? I mean, the question I've asked both of them, both those two guests, and I didn't really get an answer, is what do politicians ask you? Because I suspect when they sit like this and they're talking to politicians, they're probably speaking a language that the politicians don't get at all.
Oh, absolutely.
Which for the most part suits them because they're in the driving seat.
Yep. In my previous job, I was a staffer on Capitol Hill in the U.S. Senate, and one of our critical roles was sitting down with senators who are very smart, but are a mile wide and an inch deep, and very few of them have a technical background.
And you had to brief them.
Yeah, and you have to talk them through, what does this mean? What are the implications of this trend? If you're going to sit down with a witness, this is how you should be thinking about the questions that you need to ask. And just, ask me all your stupid questions right now so that we can figure out the baseline of what you need to know, and then take that forward into a really hard-hitting hearing, because that's their job. They need to ask those really hard questions and get real answers, much like your job. I hear you. I hear you on the convenience. I had to cook dinner for 20 people recently, and what did I do? I went to ChatGPT and I said, I want a menu, I want a timetable, I want an ingredient list, and I mean, it's helpful in the little things and the big things. I wanted to ask you though.
Was it really useful? Like a menu you wouldn't have otherwise thought of, timings that worked?
Well, so I am totally spoiled in that I don't cook, and my husband cooks in the family, and he's really good at it. So it's very rare that I have to do this. And I guarantee I would have been standing there at the stove with 4 things burning at the same time. So yes.
I love it. So ChatGPT gave you the menu and the timetable, and you handed it to your husband to do that. I need to learn from you, Emily.
I wish it were quite that easy. Yeah. I wanted to ask you about a moment, though, with Mustafa Suleyman, where he was talking about how he uses AI in his daily life, and he said that he does a debrief with Copilot in his car on the way home from work, and how anything that's on his mind, he just has like a 5-minute conversation where he dumps it with the AI, and the AI learns how to respond, learns the patterns, and can ask you questions, and he feels better after it's over. And he said something along the lines of almost like talking to a friend. And when he said that, I paused. A little red flag went up in my head, and you could almost hear in your voice a pause as well, where you said, do you see a potential problem there? Is there anything wrong with that? And I was just curious, what was going through your head at the moment, and then what do you think of that potential to lean on AI for an interpersonal relationship that we clearly all crave?
At the time, I was taken aback when he said that, and he did also used the words emotional support, and something close to emotional support, I think, was the way he expressed it. And it was startling at the time, but when I thought about it afterwards, I thought so many people require an interaction that they are just not going to get in any form. It's not like there is someone else they can talk to in any way, right? Young person, older person, perhaps very elderly person, actually. And so therefore, I feel like it's not for us to knock it, actually. If you are in need of, in the same way that, you and I might think aloud. I mean, there are times when you look in the mirror and you're trying to prepare for a job interview. Have you ever done a job interview looking in the mirror and trying to, I have.
Sure, yeah.
And so I think these are the tools of our age. And I think it's really important not to be sniffy about them, which sometimes that is my instinct, and I'm not saying healthy skepticism is not important. It's really well placed. It's also how technology develops and how we test technology. But I think there is so much loneliness and lack of companionship and lack of being able to sense check anything, right? And I think if people are smart enough to turn to AI to talk some things through, good luck to them.
Sure,
because it may not be a case of it replacing something they could get somewhere else. That may be entirely absent in their lives, and if so, this is a valuable service.
I like the idea of it being like a practice friendship as well. There some people I think have a hard time having a human interaction without feeling awkward about it, and if you could practice with an AI agent, that's great.
Yeah.
What I worry about is that so many of the systems in place today are designed first to agree with you and not challenge you. So you'd almost have to program a companion that is going to be agreeable, but then also still occasionally disagree with you and not just tell you that everything you think is right. Otherwise, you kind of fall into the same social media hole where it's the algorithm just showing you things you already agree with.
Totally. But aren't these the problems that we've had forever? Aren't these aversions of exactly what human beings have lived with. The kind of rubbish lines that we've all had in breakups, it's not you, it's me. I mean, today you hear a version of that and you're like, oh, rubbish line came from ChatGPT. But humans have come up with rubbish lines forever.
That's where ChatGPT got it, from the humans with the rubbish lines.
Yes, absolutely. So I think that, I think the really interesting frontier of all of this, that either people are really sanguine about the question of what happens when AI gets more intelligent than us. That is, I think, a really interesting divide within the AI world, because Mustafa Suleyman would take the view that we need very strict controls around that, and Fei Li's view is different. That essentially we are a long way from that, and we will get the AI that we create. So I think we are on the cusp of this extraordinary frontier, which is also now going to grow exponentially quicker than what we've seen so far. So, and also the financial side.
Oh, yeah.
What it's demanding in computing power, to what extent those financial investments pay off.
Mm-hmm.
We will have numbers, so we can start tracking that.
Big numbers. We're looking at the economic impacts too. So if you do have this system that potentially could displace a whole generation of workers, what do you do with those people?
Totally.
How do you keep them engaged in a democracy?
Totally. But Mustafa Suleyman's version of that, or view on that, would be that AI is going to make our economies so much more productive. AI has found, savings in energy usage that human beings could never have spotted. So it makes us all so much more productive that he uses the word abundance, which is a very interesting and, compelling political concept to many people, that perhaps it means not so much that loads of us will be out of work, but human beings will not need to work as much, if you're in the lucky category of being the ones who benefit from this. And I do worry about inequality in the world, because AI is a US-China story right now. That is pretty much it.
Right.
The UK, India, numerous other countries are not really part of this game. So
and historically, we have not been traditionally very good at redistributions of wealth. So it's going to be a moment where there could be huge concentrations of wealth. And how do you keep a society moving forward when you've got these big divisions? I think it's going to be the question of the next generation. So on that note, you have this wonderful curiosity about individuals, and clearly you're very good at working with people to really get to the heart of a story. I want to ask you a sort of a provocative question, which is that, do you believe in the great man, and for the purposes of this podcast, we'll say great woman, theory of history? Do you think that people shape history, or that history shapes events and shapes the people around them, given the folks that you've interacted with throughout your career? Do you see people who are really driving events forward?
For the most part, I feel that people respond and grow when they're faced with extreme situations. Not everyone will respond positively or grow in that setting, but I think most of the great men or women we look at in history were faced with extreme times. Winston Churchill is probably a prime example, and rose to the occasion. And I think that, in a microcosm of that, we can probably trace that in our own lives. I can as well. That the instances in my professional life which I found the hardest were also ultimately the most rewarding. When I became the presenter of the BBC's Today programme, which is incredibly scrutinised programme, where almost everyone in power in the UK will wake up in the morning, turn on the radio, and will listen to that programme. Now, you make a mistake on that programme, you are incredibly professionally exposed. It's potentially career-ending, on any given shift. And it was an absolutely terrifying place to step into, but I feel like it made me into a much better journalist, because I had to grapple with things at a much higher level than I was used to. And I thought I was a pretty decent journalist before, but the level at which, the intellectual level and the external scrutiny, that combination just lifted my game. And I think I'm an, okay person intellectually, but I wouldn't be the journalist I am today had I not had that, I mean, we're not talking like a war zone situation, but in journalistic terms, it was very exacting. So I think that's really the theory of people which I would ultimately espouse.
Yeah, people do rise to the occasion. It's absolutely true. I can say the same thing about lots of moments in my career as well, where it's a crucible, and it really does spit out a better version
The
of
crises
you.
made you, do you think?
Oh, yeah. I mean, I've had a real talent in my career for being in the right place at the wrong time, and I have learned that I am a very good stormy sea captain. When everything's going insane around me, I can cut to the heart of the matter, and I can lead a team through a really challenging moment. And that's not something you learn any other way. I think there are lots of people who think that they're going to be good in a crisis, and then the crisis hits, and it turns out, maybe not.
Will you forgive me if I turn the tables?
Oh,
and
dear,
ask
here we go.
you-
Okay.
Ask you which was the most challenging?
Oh, man. I mean, it's a hard thing to pick. The one that I'm going to talk about, though, so when my last tour at CIA was 2014 to 2015, when ISIS tried to take over Iraq.
Mm-hmm.
And I had gotten the job that I had leading a big group of people in the Iraq group because at the moment, that group felt like they were marginalized, that nobody was paying attention to their issues anymore. You know, they wanted me to go and help turn around morale. They wanted to make the team feel loved again and that they could produce well again. So I showed up thinking this was going to be kind of a sleepy account. And then a month later, Mosul fell to ISIS, and we went from being a backwater account to all of a sudden being in the crucible again.
Yeah. But the thing you were sent to do still really mattered, right? Because how
Absolutely.
could that team perform really well if there wasn't a bedrock of community of some description, support, appreciation? How could they do their best work without it?
Exactly. And so what you do is you try to make them feel like, first of all, they're listened to, they're heard, they're taken care of. We switched from, not having a lot to do to all of a sudden being on a 24-hour schedule. So you have to be sure that everybody's going home and sleeping. Everybody's getting enough to eat, that they're getting a moment to step away from their desks and just, get a minute to breathe. And then you really have to be balancing the workload. You always have a few real superstars who know everything and can do everything well. But if you just use them and use them and use them, then the other people don't get a chance to step up and prove themselves. And those people burn out. So you try to find a way to really appreciate everybody's talents and plug them in as a team.
Yeah.
And
I find it interesting that you were asked to do that job, because I wonder if they did instinctively turn to a woman to lead the team at that moment. I wonder if would a man, I mean, I don't know how many of your male colleagues, would they have been as intuitive or solicitous or as thoughtful of all these? You could regard them as peripheral to the day job, but they're not.
Yeah, it's interesting. I mean, so the agency has gone through a whole evolution from being a very male-dominated organization to now being far more balanced. And I think that you see a change inside the organization, frankly, and all these women doing phenomenal things. When the first woman was named the head of CIA, it was a big moment. But it was definitely a crucible for me. And I came out the other end knowing that, I could do a very hard thing under a lot of scrutiny with, in really difficult circumstances.
Yeah. The UK just has its first female head of
6.
MI6.
Yeah, she was Q branch, right?
Yes,
Yeah.
I think so. The technology side of it, yeah.
Wicked cool.
Yeah.
Very excited.
Yeah.
All right, so we have a few more minutes. I want to get to our two sort of normal segments in this podcast. Number one is what's on your desk. So, for example, I just got back from a whirlwind trip to Paris, which was lovely, and I have on my desk now sitting a huge stack of business cards, but two in particular that I wanted to pull out because these were particularly inspiring. The CEO of a company called 3 Your Mind, it's a German company that's looking at fixing supply chains and trying to anticipate potential disruptions for better warfighting. Really interesting stuff. And then Professor Robert Giekgraf, who I think I probably butchered his name, but he's the president of the International Science Council, and he gave a tremendous talk about how this is such a positive, hopeful moment for science. He said that in the 20th century, we spent all our time finding the building blocks, and now we have them and we can really build. And I love that as an image. So that's what's sitting on my desk. What's sitting on your desk?
I'm curious to know whether you organize your business. I bet I come back from a business trip or a day and I have all these business cards, and then invariably they sit in a pile and I don't go through them in a systematic way, but I think you're different on that.
I'm trying to get better about that. I'm trying.
I think you've cracked it. So I brought with me a a book which I think it's not so much because it's this book, but this book is emblematic of the way I prepare for interviews. So this is a very early book by Nigel Farage, who was guest 2 on my podcast back in October. And as you can see, it's like covered in Post-its. And this is, I have a very wonderful, small and absolutely stellar team. And we tend to often try and track down the book the person might have written a long time ago, for example, because often you can see the way that they've changed.
I do love an origin story too.
Well, not only is it fascinating, it's often really important, right? The person who inspired them, or the grudge that they have because of something that happened early in their career, it can all be relevant. But this is a classic way. This book really shows exactly the way I prepare, because I've gone through it and then I put on these Post-its, and they're all things that I might well get to in the interview. So, cancelling people, or his father and grandfather worked in the City of London in the heart of the financial district, or he talks about going out for boozy lunches and he calls them a typical Farage lunch, or the plane crash and that in which he nearly lost his life. And so, and I often put it on the desk when the interview is actually happening, so that the person knows that it's a token of my respect and appreciation for their time, because it shows that I've done my homework. But it is definitely more than a prop for me. It's a method, it's a way of organizing my brain, and it is also an aide memoir, because when you're doing a long interview like I do for the podcast, like 30 to 40 minutes, you're going to cover so much ground. You can't work in a shopping list kind of way, but you do need to have something in your mind which is like, these are the main bases I need to hit. And so quite often I'll also have a piece of paper in front of me, which is a mind map, the person's initials in the middle, and then lots of spikes coming off it, Brexit, in the case of Nigel Farage, UK politics, Russia, because he was really under fire at the time, because one of his former associates had been accused of and subsequently convicted of having a financial relationship with someone who's regarded as a pawn of Vladimir Putin's. So yeah, it's a real. I think it's also probably the kind of, we all need our method and to hone our method over time. And my method has changed since I've moved into a more in-depth format. Because I was previously in daily news, and you'd do short interviews and move on to the next thing. But now I'm in more of an immersive world, which is a wonderful place to be. But you need to have some form of organization to remember how that person's story is going to knit together in the final product.
So this is a great opportunity for me to say you can, in fact, watch this podcast on YouTube if you're not already. And if you're only listening, then it is, in fact, The Purple Revolution by Nigel Farage, and it is covered with sticky notes. It is clearly well loved.
For anyone who's just listening, it's like, it's about a dozen yellow Post-its sticking out of it.
So during that interview, there was a viral moment that I wanted to ask you about, where he looked at you and he said, "Listen, love, you're trying ever so hard." As women of a certain age, I think we've all had those moments, right, where somebody says something like that to you that is both condescending, slightly gendered. And how did you react? What did you do with that?
Well, it came up at exactly this moment when I was asking about Russia, and he really, really didn't like these questions. And so he was trying to shut it down, but also, whether it's instinctive or designed, he was also throwing in, I could have responded to it and regarded it as inflammatory. I just thought, for the sake of argument, if I was to turn around and say, come off it, don't talk to me that way, or we would have stopped talking about Russia. And we would have got into a row, and which is not what I wanted.
Yeah, exactly.
Because I wanted to carry on talking about Russia. So I've learned over the years, it's not the only time that I've had an on-air, either something verging on, something difficult, something verging sometimes on insults or abuse. And you have to make a split-second decision. And for the most part, I've chosen to ignore it and carry on with my actual train of thought. But when I talked to Elon Musk, it was, that was an example of a difficult moment when I was asking him about South Africa, and it was in relation to Starlink, and at that moment, the South African president had been to the White House, and there was talk of Elon Musk getting a workaround to South Africa's black ownership laws, which are designed for better representation of black South Africans in commerce and business and in the economy in the country. And Elon Musk chose to turn it on me and take me to task and say, those laws are racist. Do you like racist laws? And of course I was taken aback. But again, similarly, I thought it's not about what I think about something. It's just my effort to ask a question that's pertinent. But sometimes you look back in those moments and you think, yeah, maybe I should have paused and said, let's just take a moment, and do you really want to answer the question in that way? But,
it's such a deflection. I mean, usually it's the person who's doing this is trying to throw you off so that you don't get what you want, which is the real answer. And I mean, it makes sense to me to just keep hammering at the point and not let them get away with it.
Yeah. That's mostly the way I've thought of it. And I do think often women probably get more of that than men. I can't say that in a scientific way for sure, but
certainly in a different way. I mean, the condescending bit is what always drives me nuts. The bit about like, oh, sort of the pat on the head, like, oh, look at you asking hard questions, aren't you cute? And it's like, no, this is my job. This is what I do.
I think I've been very fortunate in my career to have lots of like wonderful editors who believed in me. But even then, I had one who did believe in me and gave me loads of opportunities. But I do remember as a young business anchor, after I had been anchoring for probably only a few months or a year, so I was really new to that game. I'd been a producer before. But I remember saying to him, some of our on-screen graphics with the markets, maybe we could increase the size of the arrow so it's just more clear, markets up, markets down, and maybe like increase the contrast in the colors. And he said to me, stick to what you're good at, which is presenting. Stay in your lane.
Maybe I'm also good at this, though.
And I remember being really shocked. Yeah. But looking back now, he was cranky. He'd had a bad day. Like, I know he wasn't a bad person. Mm-hmm. And, I carried on doing what I'm doing, and I'm still doing a version of what I was doing then. So it didn't hold me back, but it did. I do remember clocking it and thinking, wow, that's quite something to say.
Yeah, well, so on that note, people who have sort of helped you along in your career, we always end with a segment on who came before and those who will come after, this idea of paying it forward. You recently released a memoir, which is sitting over there next to you, Broken Threads, My Family from Empire to Independence, which frankly, I cannot wait to dig into. I'm really looking forward to that. Details your grandparents' lives through the end of British rule in India and the 1947 partition. As you mentioned, your father was a physician, your mother was a teacher and a producer, and by the age of 18, you were already reporting in Pakistan, which is an amazing. I mean, your global story is really fascinating to me.
Well, yeah, that was my first taste of journalism. Although if I look back even further in time as a child, I was lucky to have intrepid parents, or certainly parents who were interested in history, and therefore wherever we could never go on a beach holiday. We always had to go and look at ruins and do, character forming things. And when I was 8 and we were living in the UAE, my father was really driven by him. He said, okay, we're going to go on this long car journey. We're going to drive all the way to the UK. And we went on this epic journey through countries like Yugoslavia, which no longer exist, but also through
Syria. You were driving from where?
From the UAE to London.
Oh my gosh.
Across into Saudi Arabia, up into Jordan, Syria.
That's
I remember I saw
a
man with a machine gun in Aleppo. Like an 8-year-old doesn't forget seeing a man with a machine gun.
Right.
Turkey, Greece, Yugoslavia. And my father said every night I had to write a logbook. He didn't call it a diary. It was a logbook, like a ship's logbook. He was quite eccentric and often difficult. God rest him. But, I think writing this every night, and I loathed it at the time, but I look at it now because obviously I still have this. It's a treasured family possession. And I feel it taught me so much. It taught me discipline. My handwriting improved. It's also my first journalism.
Yeah,
right.
Absolutely.
I feel like that was my first journalism. But in answer to your question about people of the past, and and I love the fact that you've you do that on this podcast. When I was a teenager and I looked at people on British television, I did clock those who were not white because there weren't many of them. And I remember seeing Trevor McDonald, who was then the main anchor for one of the main anchors on British television, who has Caribbean heritage. And then I remember seeing Zainab Badawi, who later became one of my colleagues at the BBC, whose heritage is Sudanese and who also had a Muslim name like mine. And somewhere in my mind, the seed was planted that someone who looks like me and with a name like mine could still grow up to be on TV. And that it stayed in the back of my mind. But I think without them being visible in my growing up years, I don't think I would have had any kind of pattern for what I ended up doing. So that really mattered to me. And then when I joined the BBC, there was a wonderful interview program called Hard Talk, which was an in-depth interview program. And I went to shadow the presenter of Hard Talk, Tim Sebastian, one day. And, anchors, let's face it, aren't really known for being massively collaborative or sharing. I mean, it's generally a fact in the industry. There are exceptions. But he showed me his notes and he said, this is how I prepare. And I ask a question, but then I always think, if they say yes, I'm going to follow up with this. And if they say no, then this is where I'm going to go. And it just let me into his mind and how you have to anticipate, not over prepare, but you have to go somewhere down the route of anticipating what someone is going to say. And it really, really helped, literally to be able to look over his shoulder and look at his notes.
Demystify, if nothing else, and be like, so this is the path.
Yes,
the path is
because
in front of
you
me.
see the final product, but what's the process behind it?
Yeah, those moments are so important. So then looking ahead, you have people I'm sure that you're helping along the way too. What kinds of questions do they ask you? What advice do you give them?
Well, for people in the media, I have on occasion been asked, only a couple of times, but the question that really makes my heart sink is where I've been asked, I really want to be an on-air person one day. I want to be in front of the camera. I want to be a presenter or an anchor. How should I do it? And the reason it makes my heart sink is I think if you haven't got a bedrock as being a really good journalist or producer or content person before that, then I feel like you just won't have the solid ground that you build the rest of your career on. So yes, someone could put you in front of the camera because of the way you look or sort of a one hit that you had one day, but that's probably going to be built on sand, and at some stage that house will crumble. Ooh. So if you haven't built the house properly, I think your chances of having that long-term career are limited. And you might be very lucky in that foundation won't crumble for a really long time, but one day that storm will come. And so I feel like having come up the old-fashioned way is really important because you'll have a solid bedrock. So journalism, content, production, that's the best foundation for going on to be in front of the camera or in front of the microphone. Yeah,
I mean, it's great advice. I think in a world of social media, it is tempting to think that everybody can have a shortcut, that you just get to the success, but you don't see all of the hard work that goes into it ahead of time in somebody's Instagram feed. You just see the final. Yeah, I think it's absolutely true. Well, thank you so much. This has been wonderful. That's all the time we have for today. I can't wait to dig into your book, Broken Threads. Look for it. Happy New Year, listeners. Go forth into 2026 with resolve to conquer all that stands in your way. Thank you so much for being here today.
Thank you, Emily. It's been a pleasure. Good luck to you.
Thank you.